Greetings. This is Dale Wetzel. I'm the host of the Legislature Today radio show. This evening we're going to be speaking about higher education constitutional amendments. Essentially it's a menu of ideas of getting rid of the Board of Higher Education and substituting it with a number of other governorship or governing structures. We're also going to talk about whether or not the legislative session needs to be a bit longer and whether we should have a constitutional amendment that would make it more possible for the legislature to meet every year. We have with us this evening, for our first half-hour segment, Representative Scott Kelch. He is a Democrat from Fargo. He was the Democratic candidate for state auditor last year. He is the sponsor of a constitutional amendment that got its hearing today in the House Judiciary Committee that would lengthen the amount of time that the legislature could be in session every 2 years from 80 days to 120 days. Now, this would allow for either, it would allow for basically three things. One, it would allow for a lot of time left over after the legislature got its work done. It would allow for the possibility of annual sessions with the 120 days split into two segments of equal or unequal length. And it also would make possible a really long legislative session every 2 years, which I don't think that is in the mind here, but we'll be discussing that. We also have Senator Joe Miller, a Republican from Park River. He has one of the constitutional amendments, and there are several of them, that would get rid of the Board of Higher Education. Mr. Miller's amendment would substitute a voting panel of the governor, the superintendent of public instruction, and the agriculture commissioner as the voting members of a new board of regents. There would also be 8 other non-voting members of that board, 2 of whom would be appointed by the governor, and 6 legislators. And there are several other constitutional amendments proposed that would do away with the Board of Higher Education, and we'll get into those as well. First of all, during the legislature today, we'll give you a little quick update on what happened. One of the things that happened were hearings on these various proposals to get rid of the Board of Higher Education that I just mentioned. Another was there was an extended debate in the North Dakota Senate today about another constitutional amendment to set up a outdoor heritage fund. This amendment was defeated. It would have provided up to $200 million every 2 years for conservation projects and land purchases and essentially a number of things that would promote land conservation and clean water and wildlife habitat. There was some concern amongst the opponents of the amendment that it was giving too much money to an appointed panel. The panel that would have made decisions about how this money would be spent was a 10-member board with the governor, the parks director, the game and fish director, and some legislators and other officials. And these would be people mostly who were not elected, who would have control of frankly, a humongous pot of money that could be done, which could be spent on a number of things. There was some concern in the Senate that one of the things this money would be used for would be to buy up land that maybe private farmers or ranchers would want, and that they would be unable to compete on price with a state agency with a fairly large checkbook. Well, we'll get right into the constitutional amendments that I mentioned earlier. First of all, once again, we have Representative Scott Kelch. He's a Democrat from Fargo, and he is the sponsor of a constitutional amendment to lengthen, that would make it possible to lengthen the legislative session. Welcome, Representative Kelch. Could you please tell me what was your inspiration for doing this? And I understand you've introduced something like this before, and could you just tell me what your animating principle is?
Yeah, I have introduced something like this before, and originally when I've introduced this in the past, I said, well, let's go to 100 days. But as our state has changed, and the growth that we've experienced, and the number of externalities that the state has to deal with, whether it be federal action, federal laws that affect how we have to act as a state, or whether it be natural disasters or the growth in certain sectors of our economy, energy and agriculture, I thought now was the time to say, look, it's been nearly 40 years since we've extended the length of the legislative session. In 1976, the voters in North Dakota narrowly approved a measure to take us from 60 to 80 days. And at that time, our budget was less than $1 billion. I think it was around $800 million. And we're approaching $13 billion this year, and we're still limited to the 80 days in which to be able to determine all those things out. And at that time, we also have a number of measures that were primarily housekeeping, and the legislature get that done in a fairly short amount of time. But now most of the bills that we see before us are substantive. We have a lot of substantive bills in front of us, and the public wants to weigh in, and the legislators want to know more. They want to take the time to be able to look these measures over, and we just don't have the time to be able to do that anymore. So I think we're shortchanging the public by not giving them the amount of time that they need to be able to weigh in with us.
Now, Senator Miller, who's also a guest, who is a co-sponsor of this, and I want you, Representative Kelch, and you, Senator Miller, to talk about what a legislative day is like. I mean, you have 80 days to handle, close to 1,000 bills. All of them get a committee hearing. All of them get a vote in the House or Senate. And what is it like to deal with that many issues, that much stuff in that short of a time frame?
Well, it's a very good question, and I'll let Senator Miller answer this too, so I'll be brief. But we have typically in the House side, we have committee hearings in the morning, and then we have we allow the public to weigh in should they have an interest in that, and then those bills are reported out of committee where they do not pass or do pass recommendation, and they go to the floor, and then they're voted on based on that committee recommendation. That there's a carrier to sign. But they, like I said, they are more substantive. There's more money that's being dealt with. There's more issues that are that have to be paid attention, especially with the infrastructure needs and the growth in the West with the energy economy. And I don't think the public has the opportunity to really weigh in as much as they would like to, especially when you have bad weather and there's a hearing and you can't keep it open because that's the scheduled time and you're up against the deadline.
Senator Miller, when I saw Representative Kelch's amendment, I was surprised that you'd signed on. Could you just, because you're a conservative man, I wouldn't have thought you would have favored a longer time for the legislature to meet. And could you just explain why you favor this and why you think it's necessary?
Generally, I've kind of prescribed to the philosophy that when the legislature is out of session, the people are free, and we're not creating new laws. But I've kind of changed my thoughts about the whole thing and thinking that maybe an annual session is a better way to deal with this. And South Dakota's managed to get theirs done. They do annual sessions and they have a relatively short time frame to do it in. But I thought the bill that Representative Kelch brought forward, it allows for that enough time to adequately address it. And if we need to take 45 days 1 year or 50 days or 60 days, you have that flexibility to do the proper job in allotment of time. But I think it'd be better for us as a state to start considering going to annual sessions and try and do it in a 40 to 60 day window each year, because this 80 days gets long. For me as a farmer, it puts it right into spring planting. It sure be nice to get done in right about now in March, so I can get home, start working on my equipment, get in the field. But instead, we're just getting started, really. And this whole second half of, I think it also, another thing when I said weed out all the bills, and I'm probably just as much of a instigator in this as anyone. But we introduce a lot of bills to have a discussion when we know dang well that they're going to be defeated right away. And maybe people would stop introducing so many bills that just to have a discussion. There's a time and place, but I think it'd probably weed out some of that I don't want to call it useless legislation, because it's every piece of legislation has its purpose. But maybe we would bring out better legislation in the beginning and certainly better legislation in the end, because we'd have time to properly think about it. And if we needed to, we'd come back right a year later and make adjustments, and that's pretty nice. That's a good way to deal with that. I get constituents that will call me and want to have an idea brought before the legislature, but it's like, well, we'll see what happens in a couple of years. And this would allow for, I think, a more responsive but more responsible government too.
One of the characteristics of the legislature has been every bill gets a hearing, every bill gets a vote on the floor of the House or Senate. Mm-hmm. And would this new arrangement, would that impede that? I mean, would you have to have an arrangement if you had shorter annual sessions where, just to cut down on the time the committees would be able to kill bills and you wouldn't have floor votes on everything? Would that be something that would be necessary?
Well, my idea behind introducing this was certainly not to impede any public input. And I think the North Dakota system is good in that way, that every bill does get a vote, because at least in the House I've noticed this year we've turned a lot of committee votes around. There have been a lot of do not pass recommendations that have been passed on the floor and vice versa. What I think is happening is that the committees just aren't having enough time to take the input that they need so that they can give a real responsible recommendation to the full House or the full Senate. And I think that's part of what's happening here, is we just don't have the time.
One of the things, too, Senator Miller is the chairman of the Senate Agriculture Committee, and one of the bills that your committee handled was a bill that would essentially provide for more criminal penalties for acts of animal cruelty and abuse and neglect. And that bill did very well in the Senate. People seem to like it. It passed overwhelmingly. And it gets to the House, and it's like it's the worst bill that was ever written. Oh, it's got so much vagaries to it and whatnot. And I was wondering if that was an example of, frankly, having a lack of time to maybe dig into something that you would have liked to have more time to explore the underlying issues of that particular bill as to whether or not the crimes that were detailed within it were properly defined.
I think what we did in the Senate with that bill was, with regards to the proponents of the bill, I mean, at the time there was really no opponents of the bill. And I think what happened was, as we passed that bill in the Senate, then various people throughout the state started realizing what the bill was, and then they started speaking up with their opinion. Looking at that bill as it came out of the Senate, not a terrible bill, but certainly could probably be improved. I know I was a little uncomfortable with what we left in that, but I, at the same time, was comfortable enough to vote for it. So,
I'd like to speak as well about your constitutional amendment, Senator Miller. You are advocating essentially abolishing the Board of Higher Education and replacing it with a Board of Regents or a Council of Regents. Could you just explain what your proposal does and why you thought it was a good idea?
Well, what it does is it replaces the State Board of Higher Education as it currently exists, and I changed the name just to kind of show the distinction to the Council of Regents. And what that would be is the governor or his designee, the Ag Commissioner, and the Superintendent of Public Instruction. They would choose a chancellor, but they'd also be in consultation with a group of 6 individuals chosen by the legislature and 2 from the governor that would serve as an advisory capacity. And with the legislative appointments, I didn't designate they be legislators, just chosen by the legislature. And I thought that was a good way to go about it, because you can get people on there that might have a real interest in being there and not just sitting there to serve. You get the best people on that. And the reason why I chose those 3 statewide elected officials is because they're elected, they're accountable to the people, but as opposed to choosing the governor to specifically I'll make that appointment, it'd be a panel, and where there'd be some balance of power and some shared responsibilities. And I think that pulls some of the politics out of the mess. And that was one of the first worries of why the State Board of Higher Education was created in the manner it was, and that's because they wanted to avoid politics. And so I thought, here's a good way to put the power back in the hands of the people, but keep it somewhat separate. And then finally what it is it's making the chancellor more powerful. The board isn't going to sit there and run the day-to-day operations. The chancellor is going to run the day-to-day operations. And the chancellor only answers to those 3 elected officials ultimately.
Is there another state that runs their higher education system in a similar way than what you're proposing?
I really don't know. I can't answer that. But I'm sure I've heard of, I think Wyoming might have an elected higher ed person, but I'm not sure. But, there's a lot of things that North Dakota does that are unique, and why not be more unique?
Representative Kelch, as you know, there's a number of proposals to get rid of the Board of Higher Education. Why do you think this is, and do you think that the receptiveness of folks to the idea of getting rid of the Board of Higher Education is changed at all by the fact that there's been, frankly, some turmoil in the higher education system recently?
Well, I think you nailed it by saying just simply because there's been turmoil and there's been so much, particularly with the former president of NDSU and the troubles that he experienced, and then that conflict with the former chancellor between that president. So we decided to move on, have a new NDSU president, a new chancellor, and the power balance shifted the other way. And I think we're still struggling to find a way to keep that balance and keep the politics out of it. Yet, at the same time, it's become very political in of itself. And I think the State Board of Higher Ed needs to step up and state where they are and where they want they want the university system to go, which direction.
Do you think that there is public sentiment to replace the Board of Higher Education with some other governance structure?
I have no evidence for that. I don't know that there's evidence for or against it. I guess if it's put on the ballot, we would find that out. But going back to my constitutional amendment that would extend the length of time that we can meet, this is the very reason why we want that. Because if we want to have the oversight that we say we do over the growth of the state, when we have every state agency, say for one or two, that has experienced exponential growth in the last 30 or 40 years, and yet we have stayed the same, and we have stayed reined ourselves in the amount of time that we can meet and have that kind of oversight. I think this is why the legislature needs to keep up with those very types of issues. So,
one of the things that was raised at the Judiciary Committee meeting this morning, well, I thought about two things. One, Representative Clemene, the vice chairman of the committee, Representative Larry Clemene, he mentioned, the principle. I mean, that's kind of a highfalutin way of referring to it, but the idea that the work expands to fill the time allotted, and therefore that's an argument against making the session longer because it will just be longer.
Well,
but there's also the thought that really does do a lot of issues in the legislature, frankly, not get, do they not get a cursory review because of the fact that everyone is quite rushed, everyone is, hot to get their work done, meet their deadlines, and they don't really have time to reflect on things.
Well, my first session was in 1997, and we had 80 days to meet. We adjourned on the 66th day. And I think the session after that, I think we adjourned on the 68th day. And then they got longer and longer and longer, and we've been pushing up against an 80-day mark ever since last 3 or 4 sessions. And I think it's time. It's simply because things have gotten more complicated. I don't think the legislature wants to be there any longer than they have to. But I do think they want to be able to address the needs that they have to. And I don't think that we're able to do that right now within this allotted 80 days anymore.
Senator Miller, do you think that the legislature is able to get into issues in sufficient depth in the amount of time it has?
Certainly help to have more time. I think you just start talking about the complexity of the oil tax. I mean, that's incredibly complicated. And for a freshman coming in there, it takes one session just to get the basics done. And doing that in 80 days when you're trying to learn about everything else, too, is a lot of work. You know, a lot of people come, they think they might understand property taxes. Well, then I guess I don't know as much as I thought I did. And so there's a big learning curve just being a legislator, and you know, the complexity issues, the time necessary doing constituent reports. I've had a hard time keeping up just trying to get letters to my constituents and emails sent out, and you know, letters to the editor for my local papers. I don't have the time. By the end of the day, I'm exhausted. I need to go home and take a rest. You know, it's simple as that. And trying to find time to exercise or something like that it's a difficult tasking on the individual.
I should bring this up that Representative Kelsch and Senator Miller and other legislators, almost all of them, in fact, they do not have staff people to work for them. They don't have people to answer their mail or answer their telephone. These are things they do themselves. And so not only are they working on legislation, amendments, trying to figure out where they stand on things, they're also answering email. They're dealing with constituent phone calls. Constituents show up to visit. Their school classes show up, and it's there's quite a lot of demand on one's time. Just a quick, I need a fairly short answer from both of you gentlemen. Do you think that the idea of annual sessions with the new milieu we have in North Dakota with the population growth and whatnot, do you think that there's more sentiment in favor of annual sessions than there has been?
I think we saw that this time. We had a House sponsor that was a Republican who had opposed annual sessions in the past and was the prime sponsor of a bill to take us to annual sessions. And, you know, it was defeated, but ultimately because we were informed that we can do that by rule already. We don't need to put that in statute to have an annual session. So,
what do you think, Senator Miller? Do you think that there's more sentiment for annual sessions?
I'm hearing it more and more from people. I think they feel that we should go down that road, and it'd probably be better for our state.
We've been talking to Senator Joe Miller. He's the gentleman whose voice you just heard. He is a Republican from Park River. He's the chairman of the Senate Agriculture Committee and the sponsor of a constitutional amendment to abolish the Board of Higher Education in favor of a Board of Regents that would be headed by the governor. We've also have with us Representative Scott Kelsch. He's a Democrat from Fargo and the sponsor of... Good evening. My name is Dale Wetzel. I'm the host of the Legislature Today radio show. We're broadcasting from the Peacock Alley American Bar and Grill in downtown Bismarck. I'm looking out the plate glass window and wondering why it's light outside. This is really weird. This extra hour of daylight takes some getting used to. We are here in the second half hour the first hour of our show with a gentleman from the Northwest Landowners Association. We also have with us as guests Representative Kenton Onstead. He's a Democrat from Parshall and the House Democratic leader in the North Dakota legislature. We also have Representative Bob Hunsker, a Democrat from Newburgh. He represents a district that includes some of North Dakota's top oil-producing areas. And welcome, gentlemen. And first of all, I should say, I beg your pardon, the gentleman we have with us from the Northwest Landowners Association is Mr. Coons, Mr. Troy Coons. He's the vice chair of the organization. And, sir, please tell us about your organization, how long you've been in existence, and why you got started.
I guess we, in an informal fashion, started about 6 years ago. In a formal fashion, it's been about 3 years. We started because we saw some inequitable things happening in the oil patch, and thought there should be somebody there for a check and balance to have fair and equitable treatment for the landowners. We have a 13-person governing board. We have Bob Grant from the Berthold area is the treasurer, Galen Peterson from up by Souris, Myron Hansen from up by Souris, and myself from the Donnybrook-Kenmare Stanley area.
And how did this organization get started, sir? I mean, did you just tell me about that?
When the oil impact was first happening in Austin Township, we heard a lot of things that kind of come through. The Ag Improvement Association heard about it. It was something that I saw there was a need for, somebody that could focus on this. And so we just stayed after it. We were here 2 sessions ago, just 4 of us come down here on our own and saw the need for it, and that's when we became more formalized.
And who was it that did most of the work of organizing, sir?
At the start of this, it would have been myself and Bob Grant were the 2 that started the organization.
And what do you have dues, or how
Yes,
does it
we
work?
do.
What are the dues?
The dues are $100 per year. With that, we have a website. We have email alerts. They can call in with questions. We'll try to get them answers. And it's not only just related to oil and gas. It's any surface right type issues or mineral issues.
Was there no existing organization that suited your particular needs up where you are?
No, there was nobody that was active in this area.
And could you tell me what sort of issues the association's been following during the session, sir?
We've been watching reclamation type issues, commencement of drilling, setbacks for oil sites from residences. We've been with in the end game looking at reclaiming things when there is no active company to go after, those type of things.
Representative Onstead, how has the association, and also Representative Hunsker, if you could address this question as well, how has this group of folks been helpful to you as you seek to deal with the impact of energy development in your area?
It's been very helpful. One, they're organized at that point. I remember going back to about the 2006 session, and Representative Hunsker and I and a couple others, we'd bring some issues forward, and it was just us and maybe 1 or 2 landowners that would come in and testify on behalf of what was kind of happening. Today, they represent well over 300 members. There's a couple other organizations that are big membership. Now they come in, and you'll have a packed house of people trying to represent that and be willing to speak and so on. So it's been very helpful. And when it gets to the hearing process, when you have the individual landowners that are affected, it's way more effective than myself to stand up and say, here's a problem.
Representative Hunsker, how useful has the association been, and how have they helped you do your job?
Well, Dale, I can say that the last session, 2011, I believe the Northwest landowners had 4 major bills, and I was on the subcommittee that dealt with them, and we had to deal with the petroleum industry and the landowners. And they were a mile apart, of course, to start with. And what we did was ask those 2 entities to go into a room and settle their problems. And lo and behold, after a day or 2, they came out and it was pretty much settled, and there wasn't a whole lot for the subcommittee or the committee to do. Now this year we ran into a similar situation where the Northwest landowners, I believe, had 7 bills that were of concern. 5 of those have been passed at this point, much to the credit of the petroleum industry and the Northwest landowners, in particular Ron Ness and Myron Hansen, the president of each of them, in working together to come up with a solution. Not always seeing eye to eye, but we did get many things accomplished, not to the goal Northwest landowners wanted, but it's a year-by-year, session-by-session process as they come together.
Representative Hunsker, what sort of issues has the association been working on, and what have been the sticking points?
Well, one of the issues, as you heard from Mr. Coons, is the setbacks. That's one of the major ones. And Northwest,
can you explain what a setback is, please?
A setback is the distance that the drill site is away from an occupied building. Current law, that's at 500 feet. Northwest landowners came in and wanted it at 1,320 feet because many people were complaining about the flares, they were complaining about the odor, they were complaining about their kids running out and too close, the danger that's involved. When the dust settled there, it ended up back at 500 feet, that a well site would be from an occupied building. However, there was some progress made because one of the concerns was where are the tanks, where is the flares, and now they have to be at a greater distance from an occupied building than the well site is. prior to that, they could have been between the well and the occupied building. So, as I said, step by step, the two entities come closer together.
Mr. Coons, could you tell us what a flare is and what it's like to have a flare within 500 feet of your home?
Well, that's where they're flaring off the gas. With that, it's most always daylight. You will have sometimes where the flares go out. They do have automatic igniters, but sometimes they don't work. So you'll find that people will be, if the primary wind is blowing towards a home, it'll affect people's respiratory, their eyes, that type of thing. The H2O gas also is an issue there, and that's why we were trying to get it further away from the homes so it would disperse before it got to them.
Representative Hunsker mentioned the setback. Could you tell us about another issue that's particularly important to the association that you've been dealing with?
With that, we also wanted the tanks and the treaters to be further from the home as well, and that's where we've got it, where anything that's under 1,000 feet, the treaters and flares need to be away from the home. We're hoping when we get onto the Senate side here that we can make more progress there.
Mr. Coons, what is a treater?
That's where they deal with treating with the separating and treating the gas and the oil on site.
I understand, sir, that one of your concerns is the reclamation of drilling sites and also pipelines that might be no longer of use. And can you tell us how you're trying to address those issues?
That's the one that's probably the closest to me. Growing up as a farmer and a rancher, it's kind of ingrained in you to be a steward of the land. It's part of you. There's said to be 250 square miles that will be taken up by this by the time the end of the oil play is done. That's a big concern that in the end we should have a baseline for, like on an oil site, that we can test it for its salts, its compaction, its organic matter. And all anybody's looking for there is to have it back to par in the end, not asking for any more. That's something that we're really concerned about.
Have you taken, how different is this from the reclamation of coal mine land?
It's like there's two different worlds. The coal is monitored and has a extensive plan in place. We do not have that, and we were looking something more region or site specific here.
Representative Unstead, how large of an issue in your district is the reclamation of drilling sites and pipeline sites? And also, could you tell us where your district is?
Well, first of all, my district is District 4, and I go from Dunn County to McKenzie County. We get Montreux County, we get Ward County, actually 6 counties, about 5,000 square miles. So from Kenmare all the way down to Halliday is line north and south line. We go east all the way to Garrison Max area. And of course, we're on both sides of the river. So we're right in the heart of a lot of this impact. The reclamation is key. Is number one is that the land they want to restore back to normal when it goes away. And so when they look at reclamation, how is that going to be treated? Is the production going to be the same and so on? Coal reclamation, they come in and they rip it open and so on. And after 3 years, if it isn't back to production, they come back and start the process over again. We don't have that kind of order when it comes to reclaiming a well site, because there's actually the compaction on a well site is probably 3-4 times that of what it is in a coal site. So we're just saying let's have the same rules for the coal reclamation as we have with oil.
Representative Hunsker, how big of an issue is this in your own district, the reclamation of a drilling site, of a open waste pit, of which there are many?
Well, my district, Dale, includes Renville and Bottineau County, and as you know, oil was discovered in those two counties back in the 50s. At that time, there wasn't much oversight from the state level, so currently, we have large areas there that are noxious weeds, that are where there's been salt water or oil spills, and many, many acres of land is not tillable anymore. It's more or less waste. That has been, but that's years ago. Some of that's been cleaned up now. But this particular bill, Dale, has a fund in it of money. And that money is put there from fees that are collected, donations, federal agency funds, oil and gas impact funds, funds from the production and extraction tax that would have enough money so that in the future, if there are spills, if there are problems, and the entity that's involved, the company that has the pipeline, is not responsible, skipped out of the country, there's no bond, then we can go to the state, to this fund, and the Industrial Commission can use those funds to go out and clean up the mess that's there.
What's been the reception to this idea of this fund?
I think it's great. I did not mention that this fund only applies to wells that were put into service in August of '83. Prior to that, the fund does not cover.
Mr. Coons, how important is this fund that Representative Hunsker just mentioned?
Just to clarify things, there was two separate bills.
Okay.
One was from that date and forward where we cannot find an active operator to go after to clean up the site. That's what this fund was before. It's set at $75 million. Any fines that are levied can go into this fund above that level. The other reclamation bill we were looking at is for the current activity. So if it's a year from now or 20 years from now, there's something set in place so we have the baselines for those sites that we're not trying to deal with what we're looking at in this other bill.
We're speaking to Troy Coons. He's the vice chairman of the Northwest Landowners Association, which was recently formed to deal with issues of oil industry development in northwestern North Dakota. Mr. Coons, what's it like to work with the oil industry? I mean, they have kind of a, if I may say, a buccaneering reputation. What's it like to deal with folks in the oil industry?
I guess we're not looking to be contradictory or argumentative. We're trying to work as a team here, and that's going to take us more time and more effort to get there. Up to this point, they had the Industrial Commission. There's some administrative rules and some of our bills that did not move forward. They're talking about putting those into administrative rule, so we'll just have to be a watchful eye on that to make sure they're in place, and then the key from there will be to make sure they're enforced.
Could you tell us, does the Northwest landowners, one of the big issues in the legislature has been the taxation of the oil industry, whether the taxation of the industry should be overhauled, whether the top tax rate should be cut in certain circumstances. Does the Northwest landowners get involved in oil industry taxation issues?
At this point, we have not been.
And why not?
I guess when we looked at trying to set up the 7 bills we come here with, and everybody said, God, that's a lot. And I said, well, if you look at my notebook here, I've got several pages of issues that our members should have brought forward. And so you have to condense that, and you can only do so many things properly. And so we just got so many things coming at us. It is something that should be looked at, but it's nothing that we've been dealing with, no.
Was it a situation of like sticking to one's knitting, or is it is it like that?
With this, like I mentioned earlier, we're not only oil, it's all surface right issues. We want people from Fargo to Williston to be involved with us. We're not looking at just one thing. What
when you say you want all, you're a kind of a comprehensive surface rights organization.
Correct.
What sort of other surface rights issues do you deal with that they may or may not have anything to do with the oil industry?
Well, and when I say that, I would say 99.9% of our calls or letters right now are related to that, but I want everybody to be aware that we are there for other issues as well.
Representative Onstead and Representative Hunsker, to what extent, if any, are oil taxation issues wrapped up in this debate about how the industry works with landowners and respects landowner rights?
It's really a separate issue from the landowner rights and taxation of the oil companies and so on. The only connection is the fact that when they come onto a site, right now current law is more supportive of the ability to develop the minerals, and the landowner is set with the point that all he can deal with is the damages. He really can't stop that development onto those mineral acres. Now you might be part of those or you might be severed from that. It doesn't make any difference. So the landowners are looking at property rights, proper settlement. We understand you're going to be able to come into there. So what's the justified for damages? Are you going to be there for 10 years or are you going to be there for 40 years? They don't buy these sites. They basically are going to lease this site for a set amount of money. And so those landowners are looking at, well, I have loss of production over the next 40 years. What is that going to be? So that's part of their mission in there to try and get annual payments, which they got. Okay, now it's to look at a formula how to properly equate damages back to a landowner.
Representative Hunsker, is there any sort of tie-in in your mind with oil taxation policy and landowner rights issues here?
Dale, I'm going to agree pretty much with what Kenton said. I don't have a lot more to say there, but I do want to say this. Landowners have inherited their land from their parents, and they in turn want to hand that land down to their children in very good condition the way they first got it. In the middle of all this, the oil and gas industry invaded North Dakota, and the dispute set up between the two. Oil and gas is a business, and so the two of them got into conflicts with many disputes, and Lynn Helms and his division gets in the middle of this trying to settle some of the issues. And the reason I say that, and I know we all know what I just said, the reason I say that is the key to all of this is to get pipelines in underground and to get easements that have to come from the farmers. Now, if they're in disputing one another, the farmers aren't going to be very happy. Easements are going to be hard to get. So the closer we can keep the entities together, the more cooperation and good feeling there is, then the easements can be picked up easier, the pipelines can be built, and that takes care of what? Flares, trucks, dust, roads, all those things that we're dealing with if we can move petroleum, gas, and oil much smoother than what we are with pipelines. So it's a lot at play here other than just these bills.
Mr. Coons, it might be helpful to some of our listeners if you just explained how mineral rights work and to what extent the owner of the surface of a piece of land has control over what happens on his land or her land when they do not own the rights to explore for the oil or gas beneath that land.
You have the minerals and the surface. You have a lot more negotiating power. If you own just the surface and no minerals, whoever owns the minerals and whoever they have leased them to has the right of ingress, so they can come in and do whatever they need to do to take advantage of that.
And it doesn't matter whether the person who owns the surface of the land, it doesn't matter whether they want that or not. It happens anyway, doesn't it? Correct.
Yeah, you cannot stop that.
And is this one of the origins of this kind of friction, perhaps, between...
You can see that in the communities where that is happening, and most of the people we deal with are not anti-oil. Our group is definitely not anti-business. I mean, I'm a businessman. We want to work with everybody, just in a fair and an equitable way.
And one of the things you mentioned early on was when drilling begins. And can you explain why that's important?
With the oil leases, there's been some confusion sometimes in if there's a 3-year contract and that date expires and then they come in 30 days after that, then they have reasonings why they're late. Is the lease void or not? Because we're talking very large dollars here. So just some clarity so we know the same rules that everybody's playing by.
Can you tell us about some circumstances where an oil company has, frankly, used minimal activity on the land as justification for saying that they should keep their lease and their right to explore for oil?
There's been reports of putting in just an access road or putting some equipment on site like a road grader or a dozer, and then leave it there for an extended period of time. There has been some legal cases on this. Most of it is at the federal level, but there is a couple cases in the state, but it's still very murky.
Representative Hunsker, to what extent is this a problem in your district, the minimal activity being used as a justification for keeping a lease when maybe the company is not ready to drill, but they put some equipment on the land and say, well, because we've done this, we can keep our oil lease rights?
I think that was more of an issue many years ago, where a piece of equipment may be moved on some property, and that would tie that up beyond, say, into weeks or months, saying that we're going to do it, but the equipment's here, we just don't get it done, and that was frustrating for the farm. That has been cleared up to some degree at this point. I'd like to just mention one other thing is the mediation, where there is a dispute, and maybe you were coming to that, but current...
Well, actually, I'm sorry. We're coming to the end of our segment,
okay.
I'm afraid. We'd like to have you all on in the future to talk about mediation, because I think that's worthy of, frankly, of a show in and of itself. We've been speaking to Representative Bob Hunsker, whose voice you just heard. He is a Democrat from Newburgh. We also have with us Representative Kenton Onstead, a Democrat from Parshall and the House Democratic leader. And we also have Mr. Troy Coons, who's the vice chairman of the Northwest Landowners Association. Thank you all, gentlemen, for coming.